In this episode of the Askdavidp show, we head into Exchange Tower in the Perth CBD to speak to the taxation experts at Moore Stephens and find out all the information about these new property tax clearance certificates that came into effect on the 1st of July 2017. The Askdavidp show is where you get to ask the real estate questions and I normally get to answer them, but on this episode we introduce David Costanzo.
Thanks, Dave.
Now David is a taxation specialist at Moore Stephens. Is that correct?
That's right. So I'm a Director in Tax and Business Services with a particular focus on property.
So in this episode, he's going to answer the questions because he has a property focus to all the taxation needs that he does here at Moore Stephens. And David, you know, last week when I was in your office, 30th of June and 1st of July, it was pretty crazy. There seems to be some massive deadlines going on.
That's right. All the year-end planning and all the usual stuff, plus good sign for the economy. Transactions are picking up.
Oh, well, that's a good thing to hear, especially in the Perth market. Now, more importantly, 30th of June, 1st of July, there's always some changes of rules and legislation. So in the real estate space, a lot of people are getting scared of this new property clearance certificate. And I don't even know if I'm calling it the right thing. What do we call it and what's it all about?
Okay, so it's the foreign resident capital gains tax withholding regime. And what it's about is that non-resident taxpayers are not paying tax on the sale of property. So when these non-resident taxpayers sell a property, the purchaser is required to withhold an amount to the Australian taxation.
Okay, so you've mentioned the words they're foreign residents, but that was last year. So before the 1st of July 2017, it was for non-residents or foreign investors and owners. But this time round, the legislation has caught up pretty much everyone selling a $750,000 property.
So the way the legislation is drafted, it actually captures everyone because it says if anyone sells a property that has a market value of at least $750,000, then the purchaser is required to withhold 12.5%, used to be 10%, withhold 12.5% and remit that to the Australian Taxation Office. But there are some outs.
Okay, and what are those outs?
So in terms of the outs, it relates to a clearance certificate. So if an Australian resident taxpayer sells property, they'll need to apply for what's called a clearance certificate to the ATO, and this clearance certificate says I'm an Australian resident taxpayer, and they need to give that to the purchaser and say don't withhold because I'm an Australian resident taxpayer. So in the absence of that, when an Australian resident taxpayer sells property, the purchaser will withhold 12.5% if the market value is at least $750,000. With that clearance certificate, there's no withholding.
Okay, so it's not something we need to be too scared about. So the average mum and dad selling a house or perhaps selling a rental property that's 750 plus, so even at 750 it still comes into effect. You just need to go get a clearance certificate from the ATO website. And in the absence of that, if you can't get that certificate for some reason, then the purchaser will need to hold that 12.5% and send that off to the ATO.
That's
and
right.
Again, it's not really a scary thing. The advice I'm hearing from settlement agents is that the purchaser's settlement agent will perhaps do that part of the transaction and make sure that that money gets sent where it should be.
That's right. So that's what I'm hearing as well in the industry, that's obviously it needs to happen on or before settlement, so the settlement agent is dealing with it in most situations. And just again, it's not doom and gloom, because if you fail to get this certificate and an amount's withheld, then you can claim it back in your tax return. So it just really ends up being a cash flow issue where you're temporarily out of pocket by the amount that's been withheld and remitted to the ATO.
Okay, so ATO website will have all the information you need on what these clearances involve and how to get one. The advice I'm giving people is don't let this wait until you've actually got an offer on a property. Get it done when you're listing your home with anyone from the agency or any of your real estate agents. Get it done straight away. Yes. That way you know pretty much going in if you're going to have any sort of issues. Now, one of the issues that I am predicting might happen is, especially with some falling property prices over the last few years, is that 12.5% might come into effect and be an issue if someone has borrowed 100% of a loan. They're now selling that property for a very similar value, and all of a sudden, the bank that has that mortgage might not let you settle on that property because there's some missing funds. So it is something to be aware of.
Yes.
And I'm sure we could go on all day with the technicalities of this.
But the bank actually does have the power to issue what's called a variation notice, so that no amount's withheld. So even if you fail to provide the clearance certificate and there's a loan that needs to be discharged, the bank could take all the money in order to discharge that loan.
Yeah. If there's anything I know about real estate agents, they're always going to find the what if scenario. So I'm sure there's going to be some questions out there. So if you do have some questions, bit of a special episode, leave a comment or a question below, and instead of me answering it, I'll get Dave to give you some feedback and answer that. And we'll even pop up Dave's email address in the links as well. So thank you for coming on to the show.
Thanks,
this
Dave.
is the Ask David P show, where I answer your questions, but perhaps you could do the Ask David C show as well, and you can direct all his taxation questions to him, because I'm definitely not qualified to answer them. So thanks for being part of the show.
Thanks, Dave.
If you have a query, leave it in the box below and I'll try and answer it. Thank you.